Patrons from distant lands, viewers of old, it is time once again to journey down the Hobbit hole. Today I'm hoping to go over some of the ideas and concepts that I researched during, of all things, my preparations for the Was Alqualonde an Inside Job video. It really just goes to show that topics come from the strangest places and go the most unexpected directions, because I was very much anticipating in that video, and I think actually in what I ended up publishing as the video, that I would be approaching the question from very much an in-universe, more fangirl perspective, well-researched and well-supported by the evidence, as everything I publish tries to be as much as possible. But nevertheless, really, the core of that video is an excuse for me to make a very elaborate in-joke. I think, for example, someone ended up posting that video on the subreddit, Feanor Did Nothing Wrong. But in order to sort of justify that video's existence, I ended up doing some research that was much more serious and scholarly in nature about the different framing techniques that Tolkien makes use of and how they affect and shape a reader's response to his work, and how much of it may have been intentional versus how much of it was more instinctual, and what some of his influences might have been, whether those influences were acknowledged or unacknowledged, and really putting that technique, which is one of the standout, I would say, prominent features of Tolkien that sets him apart compared to other similar authors. If we can get a sense of the place that those techniques have had in literary history generally, how might that shape our understanding of what this work is communicating to us? And I went fairly deep, and I was really intrigued and excited by what I found, but it very quickly became clear that a lot of what I was researching and a lot of the concepts that I was starting to get really excited about just in their own right, quite apart from justifying the kinslaying at Alqualonde, they really weren't going to fit in that video, so I reluctantly put them all aside, and now I just thought this was a really good opportunity to share with people who might be interested all this super nifty background material that I found that's unexpectedly serious for a video that's, again, like half fangirling and half poking fun at conspiracy theories, and with one of my clickbaitiest thumbnails, which I'm pretty proud of. So to start with, we are going all the way back to the 18th century to talk about a phenomenon that became known as the literary forgers era. I think I touched briefly on or mentioned this in passing in the video itself. It was something that I had not really heard of before. And what brought it to my attention, what led me to this topic, was I thought it was a really good article. I'll find a way to link that somehow in conjunction with this track. I also linked it in the video because I thought it was a really good resource, even though I didn't end up actually directly quoting from it, unfortunately. So it's by Will Sherwood. It was published in 2020 in the Journal of Tolkien Research, which, yes, is a thing, and it's titled Tolkien and the Age of Forgery, Improving Antiquarian Practices in Arda. So he focuses on two English authors. When I say English authors, I pretty much mean that they wrote in English, because probably the most famous of them is a gentleman called James Macpherson, who was in fact Scottish. And he published an epic cycle of poems that he claimed he had translated from actual authentic folklore and songs and poems. So he started publishing these in the 1760s, again claiming that he was just translating the work of an actual 3rd century poet or bard. And they became quite successful. People praised them, they really liked them, they were kind of popularly successful as well, in so much as popular literature could be said to exist in the 18th century, and we'll get into that. But pretty quickly, a consensus developed that this was actually his original work, that he had written these poems himself, basing them on actual mythology and folklore, but it wasn't as though he had found this work and then translated it. He was just writing it himself and claiming to be the translator, and so he became embroiled in controversy. There was also a young man called Thomas Chatterton, publishing around the same time, would have been around the 1760s, and he wrote sort of pseudo-medieval works that he claimed, again, that he was simply translating and adapting from the work of a 15th century monk. And he also got called out on that Thomas Chatterton had a very short life. He was 17 when he died, likely by suicide. He very much seems to have had the sort of sensitive, romantic temperament. And so the story of his life was kind of sensationalized, and he became kind of a hero to the romantic movement that was gathering steam at the end of the 18th century and into the first half of the 19th. And I think a lot of that is because he could be seen as that, young, inspired, genius poet whose work never quite takes off as it should, and finally, his demons get the better of him, and oh, alas, he perishes tragically. So that, I think, just as much as, if not more so than his actual work, is what made him sort of this romantic icon. So those are two prominent figures from this so-called Age of Forgeries trend that became pronounced in the latter half of the 18th century. And like I said, that article by Sherwood does a really good job of examining the different methods and themes of those two authors and comparing and contrasting those elements with Tolkien's approach about 2 centuries later. But the thing that I thought was really interesting about that article is that he demonstrated that Tolkien would have been familiar with these authors and with the controversy surrounding them, which is not always easy to do. As far as I'm aware, apart from the ones that he publicly talked about as being influences on his fiction, there's not a ton of information publicly available on who he would have been reading or thinking about that maybe wasn't a direct or an obvious influence, or that maybe he didn't even recognize himself as a possible influence, but nevertheless were kind of shaping his tastes and aesthetic sensibilities. So Sherwood actually found notes that Tolkien took while in school on a lecture on Macpherson and Chatterton. And this being Tolkien, the notes are minimal and mostly illegible, just stuff that he was jotting down. But it is evidence that he was sitting through this lecture, taking notes on it, and really engaging with the work of these two authors and how they passed it off as being actually ancient texts that they were translating and arranging, and how they eventually failed to maintain that facade. And apart from just the general interest of, I've never heard of these people before, but clearly Tolkien had, and how might they have influenced his work in ways that I didn't realize before were even a possibility. The other reason I found that really interesting is because one of the problems, for me at least, with trying to understand Tolkien's goals and mindset and perspective with his work is that I can only look at it retrospectively in light of what the work actually achieved and the significance that it acquired after it was published and became extremely popular and influential particularly on popular fantasy literature. I mean, this is the thing we say, right? That Tolkien is the father of modern fantasy literature. The genre as it exists today was kind of brought into being as a response to the success of Lord of the Rings. Obviously, that's not to say that there was no work of fantasy literature before or contemporary with the publication of Lord of the Rings, and that there weren't any other very influential writers and figures. But I don't think it's at all a stretch to say that if you're looking for the type or the Platonic ideal of what most people think of nowadays when they think of, a big fantasy book, Lord of the Rings is it. And so it's hard to look at that book's composition without that lens. But it's also really important to remember that when Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings, he wasn't trying to write the best fantasy novel of all time, because the idea of what that was didn't exist until the book was published and became popular. And I think to sum that up, there's a line from the beginning of that article where Sherwood says, Tolkien ultimately transformed the work of the antiquarian literary forgers into what structuralists would call the codes and conventions of modern fantasy literature. And it's that point of transformation that's really intriguing, at least for me. So while looking at the literary forgers and, going on their Wikipedia pages and being like, how did I, not know this person existed? And how does an act of apparently intentional deception eventually become to understood as a literary technique? And how might Tolkien have understood that technique? That line of inquiry led me to Horace Walpole, which was a name I recognized much more than James Macpherson or Thomas Chatterton, because Horace Walpole wrote The Castle of Otranto, which is considered to be one of the first, if not the first, Gothic novels. Gothic here not meaning relating to the Gothic people of Germany, but as a literary genre. So here's another guy who essentially founds a genre of fiction. And again, we find that he is presenting his own original work as if it were his English translation of what he claims is an Italian manuscript from the 1500s that itself is a record of a story that originated in the medieval period from the 12th or the 13th century. And even at the time, this was kind of a stretch. It's pretty unlikely. Again, the book received great acclaim and great popular success, and eventually Horace Walpole came out and admitted in the second printing or the second edition that, yeah, it was me all along, guys. So this is the beginning of Walpole's preface to the second edition. The favorable manner in which this little piece has been received by the public calls upon the author to explain the grounds on which he composed it. But before he opens those motives, it is fit that he should ask pardon of his readers for having offered his work to them under the borrowed personage of a translator. As diffidence of his own abilities and the novelty of the attempt were the sole inducements to assume that disguise, he flatters himself he shall appear excusable. He resigned his performance to the impartial judgment of the public, determined to let it perish in obscurity if disapproved, not meaning to avow such a trifle unless better judges should pronounce that he might own it without a blush. So basically, yeah, sorry for fooling you guys. I was just too embarrassed to put my name on this. I didn't know how it would be received, whether it would be any good or not. That, I think, is a little bit disingenuous. Were you really too embarrassed to admit that you had written it, or was this a calculated move because you figured there would be more interest in and revenue derived from something that was supposed to be an authentic, long-lost tale that had recently been uncovered versus, like, the novel of some guy writing a book? But there's also a sort of historical, cultural context that we have to pay attention to here, because Walpole, like Chatterton and Macpherson, is writing in the 1760s. And there was a huge cultural stigma at that time against any writing that was outlandish or sensational. At this point, even the idea of a novel as a literary form was somewhat suspect. It was deemed not appropriate for intelligent gentlemen to be writing fiction, much less fiction where there's spooky castles and ancient curses and ghosts and things. Instead, there was this emphasis on order and balance and this sort of classical mentality where everything should be proportionate and rational. And so, again, as weird as it might sound to us, Horace Walpole would have been looked down upon for writing a well-selling, popular, influential, exciting work of fiction when respectable writers were either doing political essays or pieces of scientific or historical scholarship or maybe, like, at most, a didactic poem. And it seems that this actually had a lot to do with rising literacy rates. So if we think about the late 18th century, we're kind of crossing over from a world in which being able to read and having read broadly enough to get anything like what could be considered an education was one of the defining characteristics of the upper social, political, economic class. That class system was starting to undergo some significant changes, which included more widespread literacy among the emerging middle classes. So the response to that was to sort of start gatekeeping the definition of what proper literature was. You know, it's only proper literature if it has references and allusions to classical history or mythology, or a really mathematical meter and rhyme scheme. Basically, the kind of literature that you not only have to know how to read to be able to enjoy, but you have to know how to read and you have to have been brought up and exposed to a particular rarefied context. Versus, like, a novel, which is just a story about interesting things happening to people, written more or less straightforwardly. That's far more accessible and far more appealing to people who know how to read but don't necessarily have a history of 10 to 15 years of expensive continental private education and tutoring. So there really was a little bit of a culture war at work here, and these forgers, Chatterton and Macpherson, and to an extent Walpole, are in this position where the only socially acceptable way to produce art with a more romantic, fantastical perspective was to present themselves as scholars, researchers, and translators who were presenting something very sensational, but the sensationalism didn't come from them. Now, Walpole somehow managed to finagle out of getting into too much trouble over this because Castle of Otranto was, I think, just so darn popular. He made so much money off of it that it didn't matter anymore. Money is ultimately the thing that makes something respectable, I guess. And so he comes out and admits, yes, it was me all the time. And then he gets the opportunity to go on and sort of brag about what it is he was trying to accomplish that turned out to be so well received. And here he's expressing sentiments that are very Tolkienian, in my opinion. So after asking forgiveness for having basically fooled his readers, he goes on to say in his preface, "It was an attempt to blend the two kinds of romance, the ancient and the modern. In the former, all was imagination and improbability. In the latter, nature is always intended to be, and sometimes has been, copied with success. Invention has not been wanting, but the great resources of fancy have been dammed up by a strict adherence to common life. But if, in the later species, nature has cramped imagination, she did but take her revenge, having been totally excluded from the old romances. The actions, sentiments, conversations of the heroes and heroines of ancient days were as unnatural as the machines employed to put them in motion. The author of the following pages thought it possible to reconcile the two kinds. Desirous of leaving the powers of fancy at liberty to expatiate through the boundless realms of invention, and thence of creating more interesting situations, he wished to conduct the mortal agents in his drama according to the rules of probability. In short, to make them think, speak, and act as it might be supposed mere men and women would do in extraordinary positions." And I think some of those ideas definitely line up with Tolkien's stated goals, or some of his stated goals for his writing. And I should stop and note here that the Castle of Otranto kind of started or codified this trend, but it is a trope and a convention used widely in Gothic literature to present the story as a translation or interpretation or retelling of an actual ancient story. And increasingly, the understanding was that you weren't necessarily meant to sincerely believe that. It was just a device of the author to kind of add more interest or spice or excitement to their novel. And what I think Tolkien identified about this technique and the way maybe he would have phrased it is that it represents an invitation to secondary belief. You're starting out by asking your reader to buy into a secondary reality. You're making kind of a bridge between primary reality and your secondary sub-created reality, within which you hope events will be believable according to the rules and premises set out in that secondary reality. And in a way, by creating a fictional story or identity for the piece of work itself, by calling it a translation of something that's already been handed down through the ages, you're calling attention to that shift that needs to take place in order to engage with this kind of a story on its own terms. And the last thing I kind of wanted to point out here is how this research kind of collapsed my sense of time a bit. I think most people are pretty comfortable with Tolkien being a modern writer. Maybe not modern in his philosophy, and of course famously influenced more by medieval and even ancient history and literature, according to his own account. But the age of the literary forgers was barely a century before Tolkien's birth. And moreover, the rise of interest in ancient stories and far-off legends that made Chatterton and Macpherson so interesting at the time, and then the subsequent popularity of Gothic literature, were definitely foretellings of what turned into the Romantic movement in art. And the Romantic movement would have peaked around the time that Tolkien's parents were born. Tolkien seems so relatively close to us in history, and figures like Horace Walpole and Thomas Chatterton comparatively seem so much more remote. They might as well be Homer or Shakespeare, people who really lived in another world from us. Whereas for Tolkien, these cultural and artistic and philosophical shifts were things that had happened in the previous century. And I think maybe we have a tendency to overlook how relevant their project might have seemed to him versus how it might seem to us. Just because he wasn't born, quote, in the Romantic age doesn't mean that he wouldn't have felt the influence of that movement and its ideals. He characterizes the genre of a lot of his work not as fantasy, which again didn't really have the meaning when he was writing that we now ascribe to it. He and others tend to describe them as heroic romances. Certainly, I think I've been guilty of either focusing on the very old influences of Tolkien or the more immediate ones, people who were writing and publishing contemporaneously with him, and overlooking the presence of elements that were just a generation or two away from that. So that's what I've got. Thank you to everyone who's come on this trip with me. I warned you it was going to be kind of a wild one. Can't believe that I ended up re-examining the possible influences of Romanticism and Gothic literature on modern fantasy from the starting point of let's try and argue that Feanor did nothing wrong. But I can't say I'm unhappy about it, just very surprised. So I'll leave it for you guys to discuss. If anyone has any insights or directions for further exploration kind of in this vein, I'd be really interested to hear it. Maybe I'm late to the party and this kind of connection is old news to everyone but me. Or maybe I'm totally off base and I'm just coming up with wild sort of theories based on implausible threads of connection. I do look forward to finding out what everyone's opinions are on that, and I will be seeing you all next time.